Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for having me here at the first Global Economic Abuse Summit. I'm so pleased to have been invited to do this session. I'm really pleased to be attending the summit alongside so many brilliant people who are creating change for victims, survivors of economic abuse. My name is Dr. Catherine Royal. I'm the Senior Research Officer at Surviving Economic Abuse, or SEE. So we're the only UK charity dedicated to raising awareness of economic abuse and transforming responses to it. So I'm going to talk a little bit today about some research I conducted, which SEE published in late 2022, which is called Economic Abuse, A Global Perspective, and that's findings on the prevalence and nature of economic abuse and responses to it. So I'm really grateful that this work was funded by the Oak Foundation, and we wanted to use the research to establish what's known globally about economic abuse in the context of intimate partner violence. And kind of given the recent growth and interest and recognition of economic abuse, it just felt like it was the right time to kind of gather together the evidence so that we can use it to inform future research and responses. And so to do that, we undertook a comprehensive desk-based review of evidence, including across academic and non-academic sources, and both quantitative and qualitative studies, which resulted in a final sample of 864 documents. So that included academic publications, research reports or briefings, policy submissions, blogs, and lots of other sources. And so we split our findings into 4 chapters. These were looking at the global prevalence of economic abuse, the nature of it, policy responses, and then finally practice responses. And all that report is available on our website. So one of our key findings from our research was that the tools and questions which are used to measure economic abuse vary widely across countries and regions. And, obviously the questions that are used really impact what we know about how many people are experiencing economic abuse around the world. That being said, we did find a significant amount of prevalence globally on economic abuse, but that kind of varied, again, depending on the questions that were used, and particularly how many questions were used to ask about economic abuse. But as an overall kind of feel, so when multiple questions were used to ask about economic abuse amongst victims, survivors of domestic abuse, prevalence ranged from around 11.3% all the way up to 100%. And in general population surveys, again, using multiple questions, it ranged from around 4.5% to 62.6%. So it's a big variation. But in the full report, we provide kind of a summary of what we found about prevalence by region and country, also by different populations. But we also produced an annex to the report, which contains the full range of findings around all the evidence of prevalence on economic abuse that we found globally. So whilst it's hard to give an exact figure, we know that economic abuse is very prevalent and it's really something we need to urgently be responding to. And kind of looking as well at the responses in legal responses, when we conducted our research, we found that quite a small number of countries have laws in place around economic abuse. So one study found that of 190 countries who have legislation on domestic abuse, only 113 countries had laws in place to protect victims, survivors of economic abuse. And the economic abuse was one of the forms of abuse that had the least legislative response in place globally. Another study estimated that 1.4 billion women globally do not have protection from economic abuse, and these gaps were found all across the world. And are victims, survivors being protected from economic abuse? Our research found some really fantastic examples of best practice or good policies in supporting victims, survivors of economic abuse. But we also found that these examples are not widespread and they're not consistent, even across countries, let alone across regions or across the world. And that there can be a huge number of barriers to victims, survivors accessing this support in practice. So sadly, though there's been some really huge advancements made, we know that there's a lot more work to be done in order to ensure that victims, survivors of economic abuse can be protected consistently. In the research, we found a huge amount of evidence on behaviours that perpetrators are using to economically restrict, economically exploit, and economically sabotage victims, survivors' economic resources. There were lots of commonalities and there were lots of differences across sort of different regions and different countries. There was also a really significant amount of evidence that demonstrated that economic abuse is not experienced in isolation. The perpetrators are using it in the context of coercive control, and alongside other forms of abuse like physical or sexual violence or emotional abuse. We found evidence of this linking economic abuse to other forms of abuse across a really large number of countries. And looking specifically at behaviours of economic control and restriction, again, we found a really large range of behaviours that perpetrators were found to have used. So some of the most common forms that we came across included requiring the perpetrator's permission to be able to spend money, being forced to justify or account for spending, only being given an allowance, controlling victim survivors' access to a salary or to a sole or a joint bank account that was in their name, as well as things like denying money or items that were needed for childcare or for healthcare. There was so many, and that's just a few of the examples we found. And thinking about some of the cultural differences across experiences of economic abuse, it's definitely something that we need more evidence on. But we know that perpetrators of domestic, including economic abuse, will use and exploit existing inequalities as part of the abuse that they carry out. So this means that whilst anyone can experience economic abuse from an intimate partner, women and those who face discrimination based on their ethnicity, their migration status, disability, sexuality, gender identity, or other identities will experience it in other ways which kind of overlap with those identities. We saw higher rates of prevalence amongst those who were marginalised and minoritised. And so Professor Supriya Singh from Australia has argued that there are continuities and differences in economic abuse across cultures, with all cultures kind of focusing on gendered cultural practices of money in a way which denies victim survivors their human rights. But there can be differences in how this might be enacted. For example, we know from research that we found during our study that South Asian women's experiences of economic abuse might include behaviours such as forced domestic labour, unpaid labour, dowry-related abuse, taken of salary or jewellery, and that this abuse might not just be from their partner, but also include their intimate partner's family. And there's kind of a lot of emergent evidence around the different experiences of victim survivors with a range of intersecting needs. For example, we found evidence that disabled women experienced abuse in the form of having access to their mobility aids denied. They might be exploited for access to social security payments. For victim survivors in same-sex relationships, we found evidence that abusers could commit fraud quite easily because there was a lack of checking of kind of identity documents and making sure that the person who services were talking to was who they said they were. And we also saw that older victim survivors might have been prevented from being economically independent for much of their lives. And that was yet another barrier to being able to leave. And that's just a small number of examples, and we've got a lot more in our report if anyone's more interested in that. There's some really great practice going on globally to respond to economic abuse, including from some brilliant charities and organisations whose focus is on economic abuse, or who might do a lot of work on victim survivors' economic needs and empowerment, such as, and this is not an exhaustive list, the Centre for Women's Economic Safety in Australia, Canadian Centre for Women's Empowerment, Surviving Economic Abuse in the UK, Women's Spirit in Israel, Free From in the US, and Good Shepherd New Zealand. And like I said, that is not an exhaustive list. There are some really great services out there. We also know that there's specialist money and debt advice services, such as the financial support line for victims of domestic abuse, which is run by Money Advice Plus in the UK, or Good Shepherd New Zealand's economic arm support. They're really, really important services for supporting victim survivors. We've also seen some in the financial services sector make some really huge strides, particularly in Australia, New Zealand, and in the UK. There's some brilliant examples of good practice, which is so important because we know that many victim survivors may not reach out to a specialist domestic or economic abuse support, or there might be barriers such as really long waiting lists and high demand for these services, but they may be in touch with their bank. So practices like Commonwealth Bank of Australia have taken steps around debanking perpetrators who are using bank accounts to carry out abuse. There's action around abusive payment references. So Starling Bank in the UK have given customers the ability to hide abusive payment references, and Commonwealth Bank in Australia have done work on detecting and actively blocking some of these references. And other practices like TSB in the UK have a fleet fund. So if you're interested in more good practices in the financial services sector in particular, Surviving Economic Abuse has recently published a good practice guide for financial services, which shares lots more examples. And often what makes something stand out to me as good practice is when there's a partnership between organisations or industries. So for example, a bank working with a specialist in economic abuse or a frontline service, for example, like we've seen between Surviving Economic Abuse and Lloyds Banking Group here in the UK. This can make a really big difference by bringing together different areas of expertise to ensure that victim survivors' lived experiences and their safety are considered in responses. Yeah, there are some really big gaps in what we don't know about economic abuse yet. So I'd say that one of these is that we need to much better understand the different experiences, the different groups of people and different identities face so that we can have a truly intersectional understanding of economic abuse, including but not limited to across ethnicity, across sex and gender identity, across class or different income levels, disability and health, immigration status, religion, and other really key areas. We definitely need to know more about that. We also need to know more about how prevalent economic abuse is. As I mentioned, there's quite a lot of different measures being used, but we need to kind of use more reliable and consistent measures for this. It'd also be really important to know more about the longer term impacts of economic abuse on victim survivors and their children. I think we also need to understand more about perpetrators of economic abuse and how economic abuse might be facilitated by different systems or structures. And yeah, there's kind of new and emerging technologies that we don't know much about at all yet, how these are being used to carry out economic abuse, including things like digital financial services or payments. There's still a lot for us to learn about. But thinking about how we can fill the gaps in our understanding, I would really encourage researchers to consider the international learning on economic abuse, looking at existing research and whether this can be adapted or used to inform new research or different practice responses from around the world, or whether economic abuse can kind of be integrated into existing research. And for example, updating national prevalence surveys to include more questions on economic abuse or questions that have been used in other areas, which we know work to measure economic abuse. And we also need to make sure that we're listening to victim survivors and seeking out a range of experiences from diverse communities so that we can understand the experiences of all victim survivors, because that's absolutely vital for creating our responses to economic abuse and working to prevent it. So thinking about if current responses help victim survivors to get financial freedom back, current laws really vary across the world, as has been a bit of a theme in what I've spoken about. So economic abuse isn't legally recognised in many countries, and we know that in countries where it can be responded to as a crime, there might be issues with this being implemented. So for example, in Tasmania in Australia, economic abuse has been criminalised, but the evidence suggests that this isn't being used very much at all. So for example, one study that we read found that there were no convictions in the first 9 years of economic abuse being a crime in Tasmania. And laws criminalising coercive control are also an opportunity to respond to economic abuse. And we know this has been explored in different countries and different regions and states. In England and Wales, research on coercive control prosecutions found that around 2/3 of successful convictions for coercive control did include evidence of behaviours of economic abuse. But we also know that victim survivors who've gone through those prosecutions have reported feeling that economic abuse wasn't taken seriously throughout the criminal justice process. As well, international evidence has found that a lack of recognition in the legal space is a real barrier for victim survivors of economic abuse. And we know that perpetrators of economic abuse aren't always being held responsible for the harm that they've caused, whether it's through a criminal justice system or other means, such as having to repay coerced debt that they've created in the victim survivor's name. And so victim survivors might need specialist support in order to rebuild their lives after economic abuse. This can be a real lottery in terms of what's available to them in their area, their region, their state or territory, and in their country. We know that many frontline domestic abuse services are facing really difficult times in terms of not having enough funding or not having enough resources to meet the high demands for their services. That's why it's really vital for other industries and other organisations to be able to support victim survivors in a way that's safe and appropriate for that organisation to do. And thinking finally about economic justice and what that might look like for victim survivors. Still an area that I think we need more evidence and more understanding on. But I would say the most important thing is that we listen to what victim survivors tell us, and that options and responses to them can be flexible and meet their needs. Because what might feel like justice for one victim survivor might not be justice for another. And so it's absolutely vital we listen to them and we're flexible when we think about what economic justice looks like. So thank you so much for listening. I hope you found this interesting. I've only given a really brief overview of our findings here. If you want to know more about what we found, please do read the full report on SEA's website. I also wanted to share that Freefrom, who are also funded by the Oak Foundation, have very recently published their findings on global strategies for building economic security for survivors, which I'm sure will be a really fantastic resource for lots of people here today. So thank you so much to the other speakers and to the organisers for making this really important event happen.